Hello and a very warm welcome along to Real Israel. We're here with episode 2, where we're looking forward to bringing you true aspects of the real Israel from across the political spectrum. My name is Paul Alster, and I'm with you once again. I'm a broadcast journalist working here in Israel for most of the last 2 decades, and I'm delighted to say that once again I have 2 terrific guest reviewers with me to take a look at the big stories in Israel over the last week. The first is Judith Sudilovsky, who is politically left of centre. She's a freelance journalist who has covered Israel and the Palestinian territories for 25 years, over 25 years even. And she's a correspondent for the Catholic News Service and a regular contributor to both the Plus 972 magazine and also the Jerusalem Report. So warm welcome to you, Judith.
Thanks very much, Paul. Pleasure to be here again.
And welcome along too to Benjamin Weinthal, who's got centre-right views on national security and is on the right of the political spectrum. He's the European Affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and the research fellow at the Washington-based Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Benjamin also has articles featured at Fox News and in a number of German outlets, as well as writing for such as the New York Post and Haredim. So Benjamin, a very warm welcome to you too.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Well, before we go any further, I want you guys to just take a look at something I filmed outside my home just a couple of days ago. Well, I'm at the doorway of my own home, and you might be able to hear in the background, just maybe 60 or 70 meters away to my left at the roundabout close to the house, there's a demonstration from people in my neighborhood demonstrating against the clampdown on demonstrating, and also against, of course, the Prime Minister and the government and the situation with COVID and with corruption. So I'm going to find out now exactly what they have to say for themselves.
We're here as we are in quarantine. We cannot go to Tel Aviv, we cannot go to Balfour where the Prime Minister lives, so we gather here around 1,000 meters of our homes because that's still allowed.
I feel that democracy in our country is being seriously compromised, seriously threatened. Of course, corruption, governmental corruption, and for me, Bibi is not the main focus, although I do think he has to end his position as Prime Minister. I do think so, but I think the focus is that the whole government is compromising democracy.
We're here because we want Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu to quit after he's been charged with 3 indictments of bribery, a breach of contract, and we just cannot take it anymore, and it's about time for him to go and let go.
But I think I have no choice but to bring my voice and say what we, and I think, yes, I think and believe that it has some effect.
So Judith, you saw there 1 or 2 views expressed by people who had attended the demonstration. What's your view on how the public are reacting to the lockdown and also to the gathering protests against political corruption?
I think that people are frustrated and tired, and though demonstrations of the Prime Minister's house were prohibited, they have mushroomed up throughout the country. People are demonstrating for a variety of different reasons. I don't, there's different groups demonstrating. There's, against the corruption, against Netanyahu's, what they say is he's trying to avoid being tried for these charges, for his handling of the COVID crisis, for the continuing occupation. So it's a wide variety of demonstrators, but it's all over the place, all over the country, in many different intersections and bridges. People are demonstrating their frustration with the current situation in the country.
Yeah, Benjamin, do you think that the decision to limit people to no further than 1 kilometre from their home, which restricts them from being able to go to large demonstrations, has in a way maybe even backfired because it's just spawned a whole raft of demonstrations across the country?
Well, this is the 2nd lockdown that Israel's experienced. So as Judith mentioned, there is an intensified feeling of frustration because of the first lockdown failed. My sense is the protests that are popping up across the country are have mixed reasons, and I'm not sure at this point whether one can describe this as a as a intense movement against the ruling or the governing coalition right now. Israel's had protests in the past against social protests that were more packed with people, but certainly the protests are an important sign of a democracy. I mean, these types of protests don't happen across the region. And when they do happen across the region, for example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, thousands of people are murdered. So in that sense, it's bring it on. It's a good thing to have protests as long as there's a social distancing and people are wearing masks. And there's got to be a better way, I think, to strike a balance between the prohibition against protests or in front of Netanyahu's residence and the measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Well, I think that's probably true. I know that when I reported on protests in Tel Aviv at the start of the protest against corruption in Tel Aviv, I was expecting thousands of people to be there when I attended, and I was quite shocked to find that there was only maybe 1,000 people. Yet all the street cafes and bars were full of people who were drinking skinny lattes and not really paying attention. It seems to me that with the lockdown, a lot of those people that had been fairly blasé in the past now feel that the situation's got to such a point that they feel a need to go out and protest. I'm just going to hand the last word to Judith very quickly. Would you say that's the case?
I think so. I think also I just wanted to interject something here, that in the demonstrations near where I live here in Jerusalem, there has been some violent response to the demonstrations. Just last week, two of the demonstrators were attacked by a passerby. They were two older people, and the car stopped, and they were physically attacked. Yes. So it is bringing up a lot of feelings. Also, a lot of the demonstrators are being called leftists and traitors. And I think that that's kind of missing the point, because I don't think that it's only a leftist demonstration. I think there's also a lot of middle-aged, center people who are just tired of a government that's being run by a prime minister who is under investigation under 3 corruption charges.
Yeah, I think just around. Yes, Benjamin. Yeah.
If I may just follow up on Judith's comment, because yesterday Yediot Aharonot, one of Israel's largest papers, reported that one of the leaders of these demonstrations against Netanyahu a few months ago, I believe, used a racist term against a policewoman of Ethiopian origin. And I think that during the demonstrations, I think one really had to analyze the composition of these demonstrations, the numbers, what the demonstrators are saying, and also criticize, when appropriate, the demonstrators and also the response, as Judith pointed out, from the police or bystanders to the demonstrations, because there has been criticism of the police who are using excessive force against the demonstrators. But at the same time, as I mentioned, you have one of the leaders of the demonstrators using a very unsavory phrase against a policewoman of Ethiopian origin to denigrate her and her background.
Well, I know it's a very multi-layered thing, and there's all sorts of people with all sorts of gripes against the government and the authorities, but the only thing that is absolutely certain is that this is not going to end, and tensions, I think, are going to rise and rise. So we'll obviously follow this over the course of the next few weeks and months. But I want to move on to the first story that you guys have asked to speak about, and first to Judith, because there was some interesting coverage in both the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz in recent days about a decision that there could well be an expansion in the building of homes in the settlements in the disputed West Bank area, and obviously that is going to have repercussions. Just explain to us what's been going on that front.
Well, Paul, I think that, as they say in Hebrew, we're in the 90th minute right now in terms of settlements. After 8 months of not meeting, the higher planning committee of the civil administration is scheduled to meet next week, October 14th to 15th, to consider some over 4,000 settlement housing units. And this is problematic because, on the one hand, we're in a situation where we're struggling, the country's struggling with a pandemic. It's in the middle of an economic crisis with 1 million unemployed Israelis. And we just signed agreements with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, which is de facto saying that they will be considering advancing the cause of peace and dignity and economic opportunity. And by establishing these settlements or expanding settlements, it's kind of stopping that process. It's also slapping the Arab Emirates and Bahrain in the face when they sign these agreements. The construction of the settlements, it also depends where these settlements will be built. All but 2 of these units are going to be built in territories that are possibly going to be evacuated in of a peace agreement in the future with the Palestinians. They are also strategically located, several of them, in areas which will prevent the creation of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state, such as an expansion of Haredim, which is considered as a neighborhood of Jerusalem by the Israelis, but for Palestinians, this is a settlement because it's right next to the village of Beit Jala, and it will further separate 2 towns, one called Walaja and one called Batir, which will separate and cut off their traditional connection, both with themselves and with Bethlehem, which is kind of it's creating little areas where a Palestinian state, a viable, contiguous Palestinian state, will be impossible to have, which will lead us to the possibility of, one, a never-ending, continuous cycle of violence with the Palestinians, or 2, or just admitting that a 2-state solution is not possible because there can't be a Palestinian state created in the lands that are being left, and we're going to go for a 1-state solution.
I just want to cut in there and go to Benjamin on that, because Judith's suggestion that if these building plans go ahead, it's going to make a Palestinian state less viable. That's one point. The other point, what about the agreement with the UAE and Bahrain that there will be no building at the present time? What is your view on the government's approach here?
Well, I think one element that perhaps didn't come out in Judith's presentation is the agreements between Israel and the Gulf states, Bahrain and the UAE, talked about annexation, that Israel would not annex disputed territory in the West Bank. And Israel agreed to that. However, there was no mention or agreement about building apartment complexes in the disputed territories. So that's the so-called, I guess, framework of these agreements. Now, in terms of disrupting or throwing a wrench in the process of creating a Palestinian state, the Palestinians are floating into political oblivion. Just the other day, the EU told the Palestinians, we're not going to continue to provide funds to you because of your recalcitrance. At some point, I think, the international community has to recognize that Palestinians are a major stumbling block. And there seems to be some movement on the side of the EU, where the European Union has traditionally dealt with the Palestinians in a very, I would say, with kid gloves, or not even kid gloves, in a very paternalistic way, and not approach them as adults. So I do think, and I should add that, you know, that building apartment complexes in the disputed territories is a very thorny issue, especially because of the presidential election that's coming up. A Biden administration obviously would not view this as favorable. Trump administration, I strongly suspect, would have a different view. So there's a lot of calculations going into the Netanyahu administration about expanding apartment complexes.
Okay, well, just before, I want to put a point to both of you, Judith and her cat, who's very welcome to join us here on the broadcast. He's obviously got plenty to say on the subject. But I just want to put the point to both of you. Do you think there's any prospect of progress in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians if the leadership of both countries, both nations, was changed? I'll go to you first, Judith.
I think that always a first change can be helpful when things are stuck. I think people can come with different views and maybe considerations. So we've been at this for quite some time with the same old male leadership, and it may be time to inject some fresh blood and some fresh ideas from different areas of both societies.
Benjamin?
Well, you know, even during the period of Prime Minister Golda Meir, there was Palestinian rejectionism. I tend to think that there could be a breakthrough. You know, I remain somewhat optimistic that the two-state plan is not antiquated. But I think it depends largely right now on the Palestinians. The peace agreements with Bahrain and the UAE, I think, has dramatically altered Middle East relations, and there's no way you can dismiss that. And I just wanted to add one other point. I don't think building apartment complexes in the disputed territories is automatically leads to Palestinian violence. I think Palestinian violence causes Palestinian violence, and it's a culture at Hamas that's deeply immersed in stoking terrorism and violence against Israel. The recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital did not lead to violence, and I can cite many other examples that did not lead to Palestinian violence. And if Palestinians threaten violence because Israel's building an apartment complex or engage in violence, again, it shows, I think, a political culture that's deeply disturbing and reactionary.
What about settler violence on the Jewish side?
Can I respond to Benjamin?
Yes, you can. Yes, yeah, very briefly. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to respond to Benjamin. There's a difference between a declaration of a city being the capital and establishing settlements, which close the people in, because many of these settlements are built in populated Palestinian areas, which encircle the people, close them off, and create internal tension because they can't go anywhere. It creates a kind of prisons, and it blocks them off from their traditional connections with one another. It blocks them off from their families, and so it creates more tension than a declaration of Jerusalem as a capital, because that's just a declaration. It doesn't affect people personally, but when you establish a settlement in an area which is going to block off the villages of Walajeh and Batir from each other that have been traditionally connected and have had relations and have families there, you're touching the people's lives, and that creates a lot of tension and pressure on Palestinians that even, let's say, people in Jerusalem don't even realize what the Palestinians are living through right now with the establishment of these settlements, which has a direct effect on individual Palestinians.
I'm sure we're going to come back to this many times, but I would just maybe throw into the mix just to give some thought that if the Palestinians hadn't been let down so badly by their own leadership in mismanaging their economy and so many other ways, maybe life will be a little bit better. While on the other side, the violence from Jewish settlers within the West Bank, some of it directed even against Israeli forces and Israeli police, is another serious issue that has to be dealt with in due course. And if it given free rein, it will get out of hand. But I want to move on because we spoke about the Gulf states of Bahrain and the UAE and their agreement with Israel. But one state that isn't really that close to an agreement with Israel is most certainly Qatar. And Benjamin, you had a very, very interesting story. Now, even though we're covering the Israeli media, you're an Israeli journalist working out of here, and you had a very big story on Fox News that caused a lot of interest in the last few days about a cover-up by the Qatari government of their COVID-19 figures. And you suggest that's because, amongst other things, they're worried about the international community withdrawing the license for the 2022 World Cup. Do you want to just enlighten us a bit on what's been going on there?
Yes, a global risk consultancy company, in London, actually, Cornerstone is the name of the organization, provided me with a document, an analysis about Qatar underreporting their COVID-19 numbers. There's a massive outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in Qatar, and Qatar being a anti-Western, authoritarian Islamic regime is not a country that has been known for transparency. And as a result of this report, which I received, and this report showed a construction company alleging that the bodies of dead workers were sent back to Southern Asia. Many of these workers are from Nepal and other countries. And Qatar did not report the deaths of these workers due to COVID in Qatar. So you have a situation where Qatar, which is known for massively exploiting workers of color, as documented by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and other groups, is now severely underreporting the COVID-19 cases, infections, and deaths in order not to jeopardize their hosting of the World Soccer Cup in 2022. Qatar, by the way, also, and I wrote about this because this involves Israel, at one point it was unclear last year whether Qatar was going to allow Israeli fans and Egyptian fans and people from the LGBTQ community to attend the World Cup. Now, they made some assurances saying, yes, we will do that, but in terms of people from the LGBTQ community, Qatar said we don't want people to show a same-sex affection, for example, or displays of kissing, for example, between same-sex couples on the streets, or you could face criminal penalties. So we're dealing with, in my view, a very dangerous regime that also has been accused of financing Hezbollah, a U.S. and EU designated terrorist movement. And the COVID cases is just the latest example of Qatar's misconduct, in my view.
Okay, well, Benjamin spelled out the case there. Judith, what's your view on this issue?
Well, first, I don't think Qatar would allow any form of kissing or touching, even with same-sex couples. I'm not sure they would be very happy with that in public. But I think that this brings up an issue, in addition to the health issues, about how politics should be involved in sports. I just saw a report that the UK is thinking about boycotting the Winter Olympics in Beijing because of over human rights abuses of the Muslim Uyghur community there. Also, there's concerns about should Iran be permitted to participate more in international sports events after their execution of the champion wrestler Navid Afkari he was accused of killing a guard in a demonstration 2 years ago, and he was executed September 12th. despite calls by the international community, international sports people, and other well-known people who asked for amnesty for him for not to be executed. He was 27 years old. There's been calls on FIFA and the International Olympic Committee to prevent Iran from participating in sports events, and even the former International Football Federation Vice President Ali bin Hussein of Jordan has joined the cause because of the execution of the wrestler. So you're wondering here, how much do politics get involved? I personally think that Iran should be banned. I feel very strongly about the execution of Navid.
Well, I know. Certainly, from my point of view, having been a sports journalist for many years, politics and sport are always intertwined. We can go back all the way to Munich in 1936 and the Olympics there, and to in 1980 and 84, the boycotts of the Russian and American Olympics. But Benjamin, just very quickly, the story about the wrestler, because I know you did a lot of reporting on this, and as a former collegiate wrestling champion, this was something that affected you greatly, this execution of the Iranian champion. It was a dreadful thing.
Right. I mean, one point about Qatar before I delve back into the Islamic Republic of Iran. I did write recently an opinion piece, or what's called a perspective piece, for Gay City News in New York, the largest LGBTQ newspaper in New York, if not the country. And I argued that Qatar should be banned from the World Cup in 2022 because Qatar imposes the lethal homophobia on citizens of Qatar. So the death penalty is used to murder gay people in Qatar. In terms of Iran, and this is where I think on the program Judith and I are in total agreement, unlike some of the other issues we've discussed today, is Navid Afkari. I started reporting on the slated execution of this wrestler in late August for the Jerusalem Post, and then I did a story for FoxNews.com, which was then tweeted by President Donald Trump and helped create, in my view, a global movement to stop the regime execution of Navid. Now, it was a very difficult case because the regime imposed 2 death penalties on him simply because he protested against regime economic and political corruption in 2018. Now, Iranian wrestling is very popular in the country. It's the equivalent of soccer in the United Kingdom, or baseball or football or basketball in the United States, and it's a very working class sport. So this case obviously resonated with me because of my wrestling background, and Iranian wrestlers are sort of the Michelangelos of the sport, or the Matisses of the sport. These are wrestler artists because they're so gifted in terms of their ability to compete. And the campaign to secure justice, or some semblance of justice, of Navid has not ended. The IOC yesterday faced massive criticism, the International Olympic Committee, for refusing to sanction Iran because of Navid. And I should note that I don't want to go on too long, but the IOC, the Olympics Committee, has sanctioned countries and barred them for participation. The racist apartheid regime in South Africa that's now defunct, as well as the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan because of its severe misogyny. Both countries were barred from Olympic participation. So Iran can be sanctioned. Their athletes still can participate under the flag of the Olympics, but not under the flag of the Islamic Republic of regime.
Well,
Islamic Republic of
Iran. Yeah, I mean, it was an absolutely horrendous decision by Iran, one of many, as we very well know. It's an awful regime. But politics and sport, as Judith alluded to, it's something that is so hard to extricate. But there are certain precedents that Benjamin has pointed to here about Iran being excluded. And if ever there was justification, I feel, for them being excluded from a major international sports event. It was the execution of this young man who was an outstanding sportsman, and all he did was speak up against some of the economic and political decisions of his own country. So it was an absolutely shocking story. But I want to go from that shocking story to one on a slightly different spin, but nonetheless to a lot of people, very emotive subject. And Judith, something you wanted to speak about is a proposed ban that's been put forward in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, on banning trading of fur in Israel. But there are some caveats, aren't there?
Yes, and that caveat is a big caveat. There will be some banning, but it does not include the banning of trading for the ultra-Orthodox fur hat, the Streibel. Yes. And I'm just questioning
the big round one, isn't it? The big round fur hat.
You know, certain Hasidim wear on holidays and festivals, and I'm just questioning the effectivity of such a ban if, you know, this is still allowed. I think that in the year 2020, with all our craziness this year, that perhaps other materials other than real fur can be used, and I think that other considerations such as compassion towards animals, which I think is a Jewish is Jewish ethic, not necessarily ethic, but it's part of Judaism for me. And I'm not sure that if in the Torah there's anything that specifically requires Hasidim to wear fur hats. So I'm wondering whether, you know, why this is not being included in the ban, and if it's not, then I'm not really sure it's a real ban.
Benjamin, your view on this one?
Well, the ban, I mean, it is quite interesting, and I was sort of ambushed by this ban on fur products, and especially in the fashion industry in Israel. And I do think it will have an impact in the fashion industry in Israel, and of course also for the non-Haredi population, especially the population that doesn't wear these cake-like fur hats, because they won't be able to buy these expensive furs. So there is a significant policy change. Now, what Judith said about this exemption is, you know, it's not something that I'm wild about, the exemption, but given that there is progress and people for the ethical treatment of animals, PETA, the main animal rights group, and another animal rights group in Israel have both applauded Israel's decision and see it as a sort of an avant-garde policy move. So I think, you know, three cheers for Israel's decision to ban furs, and hopefully they'll make more progress on this law.
I just want to point out that the animal rights people here in Israel have said, you know, that's good, but it needs to go a step further. It needs to include all ban on fur.
Well, I just want to add a personal note on the first story, because I grew up as the grandson of a furrier. My grandmother was a furrier and my cousin was a furrier, and they made very nice things. Back in the 1970s, I used to get parcels sent from my cousin who was a furrier in Sweden. She used to send me things as a child, and one day the postman came along with a parcel which was always very exciting from overseas. And me thinking it was something sweet for us kids, I opened it, and it turned out to be a dead ocelot skin. And it was so horrific that I've been opposed to furs ever since the moment I opened that parcel. And it certainly, they look much better on the animals than I think they do on fashion models or Haredi gentlemen, in my view. But going on to our very final story, because we're running out of time and we're all locked down, we've got nowhere to go, we can only go a kilometre from home. But Israel's wildlife is able to flourish while we're out of commission, and you may well be able to see now on screen in a moment the tremendous pictures that were sent to us from near Route 90, which is the road that runs by the Dead Sea near the En-Gedi Nature Reserve, and we saw a wonderful large group of mountain ibex, and that's just a latest example of how Israel's nature is flourishing while we're locked up. It was an amazing thing to see, Judith, wasn't it?
Yes, it's just beautiful. I mean, I think it's part of worldwide, where we're seeing a lot of nature coming back to its place. We saw earlier in the pandemic dolphins returning to the canals of Venice. There's mountain goats coming back in European cities.
Yeah.
I think it's just a reminder for us that we're not on this earth by ourselves, that we share this planet with other beings, and we need to remember that we also have to allow them their space. And just as they're, gently coming into our space now, we have to be gentle in their space as well.
And Benjamin, you must have been impressed with what you saw there down by the Dead Sea.
I was. The footage was very moving. I'm someone who loves to spend time on the Dead Sea, Ain Bokek, for example, which is a big tourist site. So I've never seen that type of footage, and I think it does sort of create the lockdown creates an opening for nature,
yeah,
and for animals to sort of breathe freely. So it's it was a very nice story that was, I believe, you sent us from Yidiot Our Note.
That's right, from their website ynet.co.il. It was a really good story, and of course it's not just ibex and things like that here in Israel. We're around the region that I live in, the Carmel. There's been a huge explosion in the numbers of wild boar that are seen all over here. Very large animals, can be quite aggressive sometimes, but fabulous to see them flourishing. Although, as my wife said, there's only one wild boar in our area, and I'm married to him. Anyway, for now, I think that's going to wrap it up for this week. And as always, I'm really appreciative of both Benjamin and Judith joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed your time with us. And thank you both for being here on What the Israeli Papers Say.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
We'll be back next week. Looking forward to reviewing the papers once again with one or two new faces as well joining us. So do come back for next week's edition here on YouTube. But bye-bye for now.